Man, oh man, did I have me a cold. For a couple of weeks, just a lousy, stinking cold, but I got over it finally because we are fearfully and wonderfully made and we're able to cast off these viruses that infect us. So I'm up and about again. I'm like a weeble. I wobble, but I don't fall down. Here on this particular YouTube channel, Salvation by Grace org, I do defend the doctrines that come out of the Protestant Reformation, commonly called sovereign grace theology, sometimes called Reformed soteriology, sometimes going by the nickname Calvinism. And because I make videos about that stuff, I have people who argue with me in the comment section or write me emails who want to argue against that idea of God's sovereignty and salvation. But then when I talk about a future for Israel, which is exactly and precisely what the Bible does say, anybody who wants to argue against that has to argue against what the Bible actually does say. They interpret it in such a way as to try to eliminate the promises that God has actually made to that national group of people. And when I do say that, then it is the Reformed people, it's the Calvinistic people who typically want to argue against that because they're oftentimes covenantal, and that idea of a future for Israel just doesn't fit into their system. So it seems like no matter what I do or what I say on this channel, there's going to be people who reply back and who want to argue back. Now, by the way, I'm aware that here on the internet, if you say pretty much anything, somebody's going to argue with you about it. And that's just the nature of the beast. So I just keep turning out these videos. Now, what I did a few years ago was that I replied to the most common Arminian arguments against Calvinistic soteriology. Typically, people who believe in free will as being the deciding factor in their salvation, people will hunt and peck and find particular little verses out of context, like John 3:16, that they think overthrows the entire Calvinistic system. And so I took the time to reply to a bunch of those very common arguments. I think it's time to do the same thing again for those folks who argue against a future for Israel, because the same arguments just keep cropping up again and again and again. So I think that I will make a few videos that just reply to those very, very common arguments. Now, why would I do that? This channel has about 4,500 subscribers at the moment, but only a few hundred that ever watch any new videos that I make. So really, I'm doing this for two reasons. Number one, for my edification, because I want to know that I can adequately defend what the Bible does say, especially when people want to argue against what I am teaching and promoting. So I'm doing it for me, but also by making these videos, I have them in store so that when people do argue it, I can just say, just watch this video and you'll know how it is that I would reply to you. So in a moment, we are going to look at the first of the very common arguments against the idea of a future restoration and regathering of Israel. And I guess we'll start with the most common one that I have heard my whole life. So here come a couple of titles, a couple of graphics, and then we will jump right into argument number one. Thanks for watching. Thanks for dialing us up. Thanks for subscribing. Talk to you in a minute. I'm starting off with one of the most common arguments that I have heard against what it is that I teach and believe, what I am convinced of in terms of a future for Israel. And the argument goes like this. Jim, you say that Israel is going to be regathered back into their land. the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. However, that land promise is not repeated in the New Testament. That's the argument, and then people draw all kinds of conclusions from that assertion. Because they can't find the land promise specifically restated anywhere in the New Testament, they think that means that God doesn't intend to keep those promises. Now, I'd like to reply to that a few different ways, starting with, I think you're reading the Bible incorrectly, because the Bible is a continuing revelation of God. The division between the Old Testament and the New Testament is just a literary division between the things that were said by God prior to Christ coming to the planet and the things that he said after Christ came to the planet. Now, you have to make a distinction between testaments and covenants, even though those two words are sometimes used almost interchangeably. But when it comes to the Bible, big portions of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first 4 books of the New Testament, the events that they describe actually occur under the Old Covenant. The Mosaic Covenant is still in effect until Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. And so you have to make a distinction. Which covenant are you under? And the only reason that that matters is that the Old Testament continues into the New Testament, even though there is a change from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. But that literary division between the Old and the New doesn't mean that the things that God has already said have become altered or changed. It is a continuing revelation of God. In fact, I don't think I understand any theology that insists that God has to repeat everything he's already said in order for it to be valid. I remember sitting with Elder Ward one time in a hotel room, and we were chatting about this very thing, a future for Israel. And I remember him saying to me, how often does God have to say something in order for it to be true? And we both agreed, only once. He only needs to say it once, and then it's valid, it's true. But the promises to Israel about their regathering, restitution back into the land, God judging the nations that scattered them, all of that language is repeated throughout the Old Testament. All the prophets speak with one voice. They all come to that same conclusion, and so it is said over and over and over again. Once God has said it that many times, is it necessary that he say it again in order for us to conclude that he meant it when he said it? Now, if you insist that God has to say something a second time, he has to say it in the New Testament in order for it to be valid, then you've created all kinds of theological dilemmas. For instance, in the law, God does talk about bestiality, sex between people and animals. And he says that it is abominable. Absolutely don't do that. But he never mentions that in the New Testament. What does that mean? Does that mean that he has done away with those rules, that he doesn't care about that anymore? That if you're in Christ, then sex with animals is okay? You see the problem. Once you create a standard that says God has to repeat in the New Testament everything he said in the Old Testament in order for what he said in the Old Testament to continue to be valid, then you create all kinds of theological dilemmas. So I read the Bible as a continuing revelation of God and his intentions and his prophecies and his eschatology. Eschatology is not just a New Testament thing. The prophets have all told us what to expect in the last day, and they do all with one voice argue that there is a future for Israel. So I would say, rather than create theological dilemmas by insisting that God repeat himself ad infinitum, that instead we recognize that when God says something, he means it. And once he made the promise, in fact, the covenant that he made by himself, it wasn't a bilateral covenant. It wasn't a conditional covenant. God by himself passed through the animals to form the Abrahamic covenant. And the Abrahamic covenant then was passed on from Abraham to Isaac, to Jacob, and to Abraham's offspring continually. So I prefer to just read the Bible for what it says, allow God to say what he says, and once he has said it, that seems good enough for me. Paul, while talking about the difference between law and grace, while pointing out that the law of Moses had a beginning, Mount Sinai, and that it had an ending. When Christ went to the cross, he took that law, nailed it to his cross, took it out of the way. But then naturally, he expects people to say, well, then what does that mean for the Abrahamic covenant? And so he argues that the law coming and going did not annul the promise that was made 430 years previously. He even points out that that is the promise made to Abraham. So he is arguing for the continuing validity of the Abrahamic covenant. Now, what does the Abrahamic covenant contain? It contains both spiritual and physical promises, like the promise that you and Sarah are going to have a son. That's a very physical promise. That's actually got to happen physically in order for the promise to come true. Equally, he tells Abraham, everywhere your foot touches, everywhere you see, I'm going to give this land to you and to your posterity. And it's yours permanently. This is your land now. Okay, it's a very, very physical promise. Then there is a spiritual aspect to the Abrahamic covenant when God says, through your seed, all the families of the earth will be blessed. That's a very spiritual promise, leading to Christian people who Paul refers to as the offspring, the seed of Abraham, because we have like faith as Abraham. That's all very spiritual. But Abraham did also have numerous physical offspring. There was Abraham, there was Isaac, there was Jacob, there was the 12 sons of Jacob who became the 12 tribes of Israel. There became the northern and the southern tribes. And they have that promise of that land inheritance, and that has not changed. And according to Paul, that promise from God made to Abraham is still valid. Nothing changed it because it is an unconditional covenant. So when Paul makes reference to the promises made to Abraham, when anybody in the New Testament makes reference to the Abrahamic covenant, they are naturally including the land promise in that statement. Think about Paul, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, a Pharisee of the Pharisees, studied at the feet of Gamaliel. He knows what we would call the Old Testament. He knows what the prophets have said. He knows the Abrahamic covenant. So being a thoroughgoing, well-educated, scriptural Jew, he argues that those promises are continuing. And that means that everything that Abraham was promised, both spiritually and physically, continues to be a valid promise. Far too often, people see the spiritual aspect of the Abrahamic covenant. They see that has come to fruition. They see that Christ has come, and now Gentiles are being brought into salvation through the Jewish Messiah. And they see that and they say, well, there it is. You've already got the spiritual promise fulfilled, therefore the physical promise is no longer valid. But there's simply no scriptural or theological warrant for making that leap. Instead, if you're being strictly biblical, you have to agree with Paul, who says that is a still valid covenant, a still valid set of promises that still belong to the very people that God made them to. Next time I fire up the webcam, we will address the very common argument that there's neither Jew nor Gentile in Christ, and therefore God is done with Israel nationally. And we'll see whether that argument holds any water. So that's coming attractions, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.